"Nothing," he proclaimed, and I watched 3 nearby tables wince in unison at the volume. "I have consumed Vidian ghost peppers. I have eaten plutonian nerve moss. I have voluntarily ingested a measured sample of Zarian venom fruit, a substance capable of liquefying internal organs in 82% of known biological classifications. And what happened to me?" He spread all 4 arms now, a gesture of triumphant openness. "Nothing. Not so much as a mildly unpleasant afternoon." He reached beneath his preparation counter and produced a small crystalline vial, holding it up to the restaurant's warm lighting as though presenting a holy artifact to a congregation. "This," he announced, his voice dropping to a dramatic near-whisper that was somehow even louder than his normal speaking volume, "is essence of Kragner root. A single drop causes complete nervous system failure in 86% of known species within 4 minutes of ingestion." He looked around the room, making sure every eye was on him. They were. "Watch!" And then the absolute maniac unstopped the vial, tilted his head back, and poured the entire contents into his mouth. The restaurant went silent. I had stopped walking mid-step, my drink order entirely forgotten, one hand frozen in the act of reaching for a menu. Everyone was watching. Even the ambient music seemed to pause. Vorcal stood with his arms spread wide, that infuriating grin stretched across his face, exoskeleton gleaming gold. 5 seconds passed. Then 10, then 20. He turned slowly in a circle, making eye contact with as many patrons as possible, savoring every moment of the silence. "You see," he said, his voice soft now with manufactured intimacy, like a professor finishing a lecture he'd rehearsed many times and still enjoyed just as much as the first. "I am the only chef in the known galaxy who can truly claim to have tasted everything. No ingredient holds secrets from me. No combination can surprise me. I am, quite simply," he paused, and you could feel the entire restaurant waiting for whatever absurd word was coming, "unpoisonable." He actually used that word, unpoisonable. I wrote it down in my mental log of things I have witnessed against my will. The Krellian merchants clapped with the precise, controlled energy of people who had decided that engagement is the fastest path to being left alone. Other patrons drifted back to their meals, having seen this particular show before. The evening resumed its normal rhythm, but I noticed something in the corner of the room that no one else seemed to be paying attention to. Near the viewing pool that looked out into the star field, a spectacular sweep of deep space that Vorcal had positioned as the restaurant's most romantic feature, sat a figure I hadn't seen before. She was human, female, and elderly by human standards, with silver hair pulled back into a tight, no-nonsense bun and a pair of glasses that magnified her eyes slightly when she looked directly at you, giving her the occasional appearance of someone who could see considerably more than was comfortable. She was wearing what I would later learn was called a cardigan, a soft, knitted earth garment that, I have since come to understand, grandmothers wear specifically when they want to appear harmless right before they decisively prove that they are not. She was watching Vorcal with an expression I recognized from my 12 cycles of administrative experience. I'd seen it on the faces of senior arbitrators before they delivered verdicts, on experienced engineers just before they pointed out the fatal flaw in a plan that everyone else had approved enthusiastically, on people who had been around long enough to recognize exactly what kind of mistake they were watching someone make, and who had decided, with quiet certainty, that they were going to do something about it. Her lips were pressed together in a thin, considering line. She was slowly, deliberately, setting down her fork. "Oh, I thought, here we go." The human stood up, and here's what I want you to understand. She was small, by most species standards. She was quite small, barely reaching Vorcal's mid-torso, the kind of figure that might get lost in a crowd. But she moved across that restaurant with the unhurried, absolute confidence of someone who has lived long enough to stop being impressed by things that are merely large or merely loud. Her sensible shoes made soft, measured clicks against the restaurant floor that was somehow, impossibly, ominous. Every eye in the place followed her without quite knowing why. She walked directly up to Vorcal, stopped at a conversational distance, and looked up at him with an expression of polite, attentive interest. "Excuse me, young man," she said. I had to press my lips together very firmly. Vorcal was 4 to 7 cycles old, which placed him squarely in middle age for a Thoraxian. No one had ever called him young anything before. "Did I hear you correctly?" she continued, her voice pleasant and clear and carrying just enough across the room that the nearby tables could catch it. You claim that nothing can poison you. Vorcal's exoskeleton shifted to a warm, amused orange. He looked down at her with a kind of barely concealed condescension that people adopt when they've already decided the conversation isn't worth their full attention. It was his first mistake. That is correct. Tiny elder, he said, and I heard someone at the bar actually inhale sharply. My biology is superior to virtually all known species in the matter of toxin resistance. Quite remarkably so. He tilted his great head at a patrician angle. Why do you ask? Do you perhaps carry some quaint folk remedy from your little planet that you imagine might challenge me? There was a moment of silence. Oh, no, I thought. Oh, no. I had worked with enough humans on Meridian 7 to know the rules. There were unwritten rules about humans that every experienced station administrator learned eventually, and the most important one was this: you never dismiss them. You especially never dismiss the old ones. The old ones, the ones who had lived long enough to accumulate real history, real loss, real knowledge. They were the most dangerous beings in any room, precisely because they didn't look like it. The human smiled. It was not a reassuring smile. It was a smile of a woman who had raised 4 children, survived 2 galactic conflicts, perfected a casserole recipe across 6 generations of family dinners, and had developed, over the course of a very long life, an extremely limited tolerance for arrogance. It was a smile of someone who had already decided the outcome of this conversation, and was now simply managing the journey to get there. My name is Dorothy Kowalski, she said, her voice as sweet and composed as a Sunday morning. And yes, actually, I do have something in mind. She folded her hands in front of her, the picture of grandmotherly serenity. How about a little wager, chef? The restaurant had gone quiet in the way that spaces go quiet when everyone has simultaneously decided to stop pretending they are not listening. I'll make you one dish, Dorothy continued. Just one. A family recipe from my home planet. If you can eat the entire portion without any. She paused, selecting the word with obvious care. Advice effects. I'll pay for every meal served in this restaurant for the next full month. She let that offer land, watching his exoskeleton shift with interest before continuing. But if you cannot finish it, or if it affects you in any measurable way, you will admit, in front of everyone here, that perhaps you are not quite as unpoisonable as you claim. The restaurant erupted. Whispers cascaded from table to table like a wave. A phosphine at the bar, a gelatinous, normally unflappable creature, choked audibly on his radiation cocktail. The Krellian merchant, who moments ago had been desperate to be left alone, were now leaning forward with expressions of riveted attention. Someone in the back said something in a language I didn't recognize, but the tone was universal. Did she just do what I think she just did? Vorcal's exoskeleton blazed brilliant purple, sheer, uncomplicated delight. A challenge, his absolute favorite thing. My dear lady, he said, and now there was a warmth in his condescension, the generosity of a champion who feels sporting enough to entertain the underdog. Your species is known, charitably speaking, for cuisine that is simple, salt-forward, sentimental rather than sophisticated. He waved a hand with the casual magnanimity of someone conceding a minor point before winning an argument. I have sampled Earth food on previous occasions. Burgers, pizza, something called a hot dog, which, I must mention, contained no actual canine meat despite its name. Deeply misleading labeling. None of it even registered on my taste receptors as mildly challenging. He spread his arms in an elegant shrug. But I admire your spirit. Dorothy's smile got wider. It got a little scarier. Oh, sweetie, she said, and somehow those 2 words contained more quiet confidence than Vorcal had managed in his entire performance. You haven't had my cooking. She extended her hand. Vorcal looked at it, looked at her, looked at the crowd watching with barely contained collective excitement, and, because he had a performer's instinct for a good moment, even when that moment was being constructed entirely against him, he reached out and enveloped her small hand in his enormous crystalline grip. We have a deal, Mrs. Kowalski of Earth, he announced grandly. Prepare your dish. I will consume it tomorrow evening, right here, in front of all my patrons. And when I do so without so much as a raised eyebrow, perhaps you will understand at last why I am considered the greatest culinary mind in this sector. The crowd applauded. I applauded too, which surprised me slightly. Dorothy gave a small, gracious nod, retrieved her hand, and returned to her table near the viewing port. She picked up her fork, turned back to her meal, and resumed eating with the unruffled calm of someone who had just signed a contract she fully intended to honor. I should have intervened at this point. As station administrator, the responsible thing, the professionally correct thing, would have been to step in, remind everyone about health and safety regulations, inquire about food handling permits, mention liability waivers. There was a whole framework of official procedures designed for exactly this kind of situation. I didn't intervene. I wanted to see where this was going. And if anyone tells you I found a Corellian engineer named Posk 20 minutes later and quietly put 40 credits on the human grandmother, they are absolutely lying, and I will not discuss it further. That night, I granted Dorothy Kowalski access to one of Meridian 7's community kitchens. She had arrived on the station 3 days earlier to visit her grandson, who worked in our engineering section, and she had brought with her, this is documented on her cargo manifest, which I reviewed personally, approximately 40 kilograms of supplies from Earth. 40 kilograms, packed carefully into containers, each one labeled in neat, precise handwriting with names I could only partially pronounce. Spices, dried goods, preserved items, glass jars sealed with wax. Things I didn't have categories for. Word traveled through the station with a particular velocity that gossip achieves on enclosed installations, extremely fast and with compounding embellishments. By the next morning, people who had been in the restaurant to witness the challenge were telling people who hadn't been there, who were telling people in other sectors. A Zentari maintenance crew I passed in Corridor 7 asked me if it was true that a human elder had challenged Vorcal to a death match. I clarified the technically accurate version of events. They seemed slightly disappointed by my clarification. The betting pool organized itself without any official involvement, which is something betting pools are very good at. I heard it had spread to adjacent sectors by noon. Departure schedules were being quietly adjusted so that traders who'd been planning to leave could stay for the event. A group of Corellian engineers set up a live feed network that would broadcast to at least 6 other stations. By midday, this had stopped being a dinner wager between 2 people and become, somehow, an event. I stopped by the community kitchen in the early afternoon on the premise of conducting a standard facility check. This was absolutely the reason I went. I was not driven by curiosity. I am an administrator, and I administer things. Dorothy was already there, surrounded by more ingredients than I had ever seen assembled outside a commercial supply depot. She was humming something she later told me was from a human theatrical performance, a show tune, she called it, with a focus, unhurried contentment of someone doing something they were very good at and very much enjoyed. "Everything all right, Miss Kowalski?" I asked, attempting to peer past her at the organized chaos of preparation taking place on every available surface. "Oh, just fine, dear," she said, not pausing in her work. She was chopping something green and intensely pungent with the practiced speed of someone who had done this 10,000 times. "Just getting started on my casserole. Family recipe. My mother taught me, her mother before that, going back 6 generations now." She paused to open a jar and give it a thoughtful sniff. It's never failed to make an impression. I took in the kitchen around her. There were jars everywhere, jars of pickled things, jars of preserved things, jars containing contents that looked as though they had been cultivated specifically to trouble the unprepared. 3 distinct varieties of cheese sat on the counter, none of which I recognized. A container of heavy cream ball warning labels in 4 different languages. The vegetable situation was considerable. Onions piled in groups, several whole heads of something pungent that I later learned was called garlic, and peppers, long and vivid and colorful, that Dorothy was handling with thick rubber gloves that suggested caution was appropriate. And then there was a small bottle sitting slightly apart from the rest, labeled in the same neat handwriting as everything else. The label read, simply, the hot sauce Aunt Marge made before the incident. I did not ask about the incident. Some doors are better left closed. A Zentari maintenance worker named Kel, who I knew from occasional card games and who had apparently followed me on the pretext of also conducting a facility check, stuck his head through the kitchen doorway. He looked at the assembled ingredients. He looked at Dorothy. He looked at me. "Is it true a human is going to poison Vorcal?" he asked. "I'm not poisoning anyone," Dorothy called out, with the cheerful precision of someone who has heard this question coming and has the answer ready. She was stirring something in a large ceramic dish that had begun to make sounds of quiet, purposeful bubbling. "I'm preparing traditional Earth comfort food. Very normal, very safe. My grandchildren eat this all the time." Kel looked at me. I looked at Kel. We both looked at the casserole. "Your grandchildren," Kel muttered, watching the dish emit a small, determined plume of steam. "Must be absolutely terrifying." Dorothy just smiled and reached for the horseradish. By the time evening arrived, Dorothy had finished. The casserole sat in its ceramic dish, covered with foil that did absolutely nothing to contain its presence. Heat radiated from it in waves. The aroma drifted into the corridor and, this is documented fact, caused 3 separate beings who walked past a kitchen door to stop, turn, and stand there with complicated expressions on their faces, trying to decide whether what they were smelling was the most appetizing or most threatening thing they had encountered all week. It smelled. I decided, like comfort and violence had met at a dinner party, and decided they had more in common than either had expected. Vorcal's celestial palate had been transformed. I arrived 20 minutes before the appointed time and immediately understood that my occupancy regulations were going to be casualties of the evening. The restaurant was packed to a density I hadn't witnessed since the emergency musical festival of Cycle 9, when a power failure had trapped 600 beings in the entertainment district for 12 hours and someone had found a working instrument. Species from every corner of the station had found their way here, merchants and engineers, maintenance crews and administrative staff, diplomats and dock workers. They were packed shoulder to shoulder, tentacle to appendage, respiratory apparatus to respiratory apparatus, with a focused collective energy of a crowd that has gathered to witness something that will be talked about for a very long time. Someone had set up additional viewing screens. The live feed was now broadcasting to at least 12 stations. The Krellian engineers who'd organized it told me the viewer count was somewhere in the tens of thousands and climbing. Vorcal had prepared his station like a general preparing for a battle. He was absolutely certain he was going to win. 4 different beverages were lined up in sequence, various compounds designed to cleanse and reset his palate. A stack of pristine white towels sat within reach. He had changed into a fresh chef's uniform, his exoskeleton polished to such a high shine that it caught the overhead lights and threw reflections across the walls. The gold of his confidence was brilliant and unwavering. He stood at his preparation counter when Dorothy entered carrying her casserole dish, and I want you to understand this. She carried it the way you carry something precious. Not with theatrical care, not with the exaggerated caution of someone performing caution, but with the quiet, matter-of-fact respect of someone transporting 6 generations of family history. She set it down on the counter gently, straightened, and looked at Vorcal with a pleasant, open expression. "Ready when you are." "Chef," she said. Vorcal spread all 4 arms wide, and the crowd, which had been murmuring in low, excited waves, went still. "Ladies, gentlemen, and honored beings of all biological classifications." His voice rolled through the restaurant and out into the corridor beyond. "Tonight you will witness culinary history. This remarkable human has prepared a dish from her home world, confident, or perhaps simply hopeful, that it will somehow affect my impervious constitution. I applaud her courage." He paused, letting the beat land, even as I pity her inevitable disappointment. A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. Vorcal basked in it. Dorothy stood beside her casserole with her hands folded neatly in front of her and said nothing. She looked, as she had from the beginning, entirely at peace with how this was going to go. "Whenever you're ready, Chef," she said, her voice carrying the particular quality of someone who genuinely means it, who is, in fact, more ready than you are, and has been for some time. Vorcal reached for the foil with one hand, his other 3 arranged in a gesture of performative ceremony. "Let us see what Earth's finest cuisine has to offer." He pulled back the foil. I want to try to describe what happened next accurately, because it deserves accuracy. The casserole released a column of steam that seemed to have texture. It rose from the dish in dense, fragrant waves, and it hit the assembled crowd in stages. First came warmth, a deep, rich, enveloping warmth that smelled of cream and slow-cooked things and something ancient about kitchens in winter. Then came the garlic, and there was a great deal of garlic, enough garlic that it constituted a kind of aromatics event rather than a seasoning note. Then came the spices. My eyes watered. I was standing 3 meters away. Several people near the front actually took half a step back. A phosphine near the viewing screens made a sound I had never heard a phosphine make before. The casserole itself was a landscape. The top was a crust of melted, golden brown cheese, at least 3 varieties, layered and interlocked, blistered in places, stretched to the edges where it climbed the sides of the dish and crisped against the ceramic. Beneath this was visible, through breaks in the crust, a filling in shades of deep red and amber, pasta absorbing a source the color of a hazard warning, vegetables soft and dark with cooking, and a richness of the whole thing that you could almost feel from a distance, a density of flavor that hadn't finished expressing itself and had no intention of doing so quietly. "It's called a 7-alarm funeral casserole," Dorothy explained, in the helpful tone of someone providing context before a presentation. "My grandmother created the recipe during the food shortages of the Second World War. She always said, if you're going to survive something terrible, you deserve to eat something magnificent while you do it." She paused. "It's been a family staple ever since." "Funeral," someone in the crowd whispered. "7 alarms," said another voice, with considerably more concern. Vorcal, to his genuine credit, didn't hesitate. He picked up a serving spoon, drove it deep into the casserole with the confidence of being who has never, not once, had reason to be afraid of food, and extracted a portion. A substantial portion. A portion that would have been generous for a family of 4. The filling steamed on the spoon. 3 different types of cheese stretched in long, unbroken strings back toward the dish. The sauce dripped in slow, heavy drops, each one landing with a sound that suggested weight and consequence. "Smells rich," Vorcal observed. His voice was still confident, but I noticed, I was watching carefully, that his exoskeleton had shifted from its brilliant competition gold to a slightly more neutral blue, the color of someone recalibrating. Heavy on the aromatic compounds. Certainly, a bold choice, but nothing my system can't process with ease. He brought the spoon to his mouth. The restaurant held its breath. I am not exaggerating. The environmental system seemed to quiet itself. 200 beings and whatever I am stood in absolute, reverential silence as Chef Vorcal, the Unpoisonable, the master of 743 culinary arts, the being with consumed Zarian venom fruit without blinking, took his first bite of Dorothy Kowalski's 7-alarm funeral casserole. He chewed. His exoskeleton held its neutral blue. He swallowed. He smiled, opened his mouth to speak, drew breath for what was clearly going to be his opening declaration of victory. His exoskeleton flashed white. I had been stationed on Meridian 7 for 12 cycles. In that time, I had seen Thoraxians express the full spectrum of their biological color vocabulary. I had seen rage and delight, grief and triumph, the particular dark green of embarrassment and the soft pink of genuine affection. In 12 cycles, I had seen a Thoraxian turn white exactly 3 times, always in situations of extreme physiological crisis. White is not a Thoraxian color. It is what happens when their internal regulatory system overloads, when the precise, elegant biological machinery that manages their responses simply cannot decide what it's supposed to be doing and defaults to a panic blankness. "Interesting," Vorcal said. His voice was perhaps a quarter step higher than his normal register. "There is a certain warmth to this dish." He nodded with the effortful control of someone trying very hard to appear unaffected. "Quite pleasant. Very pleasant. Exceptionally pleasant." He was sweating. I did not know Thoraxians could sweat. I had no documentation of it. I later checked the station's medical database and found only one prior recorded instance in an emergency exposure situation, which I think tells you something about where we were headed. Droplets were forming on his crystalline exoskeleton and catching the restaurant lights, turning him into something that sparkled in a deeply troubled way. "Perhaps another bite," he said, and his hands, all 4 of them, were not quite steady as he raised the spoon again. To fully appreciate the complexity, the depth of the flavor profile requires. Dorothy said nothing. She folded her hands slightly tighter and maintained her expression of polite, expectant interest, the expression of someone who is at a table and is simply waiting for dinner to proceed as expected. The second bite went down. Vorcal's exoskeleton cycled through 6 colors in approximately 3 seconds. White, blue, green, yellow, orange, red. Then it settled on a color I had not previously encountered in my experience of Thoraxian biology, something in the range between deep purple and ultraviolet, a color that existed at the boundary of what most species' visual systems were calibrated to process, a color that seemed faintly inappropriate to occur in normal space. "The cheese!" he gasped, reaching for the first of his prepared beverages and downing it in a single, desperate motion. What type of cheese is this?" "Oh, just some cheddar, mozzarella, and a pepper jack my niece makes on her farm in Wisconsin," Dorothy said pleasantly. "The cows are fed a diet-heavy and capsaicin-rich feed. Makes the milk run naturally spicy. Family secret, really." "Naturally spicy," Vorcal repeated, and then stopped because apparently the concept required a moment to fully absorb. He reached for the second beverage, drank half of it, set it down with immense precision. "Clever," he said, and even through the strain there was something in his voice that might, in another context, have been genuine admiration. "Very clever, but not enough. Not nearly enough to stop me." The third bite was smaller, much smaller. His hands were shaking noticeably now. His exoskeleton had stopped making decisions about which color to be and had instead entered a state I can only describe as a flickering, a rapid cycling through hues so fast that they blurred together into a kind of chromatic static. People near the front were squinting. A young Zenthrai engineer had turned away, reportedly because the visual effect was inducing mild vertigo. The source, Vorcal wheezed, his composure now wearing very thin at the edges. "Tell me, what is in the sauce?" Dorothy looked at the ceiling briefly, the gesture of someone consulting a mental list. "Tomatoes, heavy cream, ghost peppers, Carolina reapers, a few Trinidad Moruga scorpions, some Thai bird's eye chilies I had left over from breakfast preparations, and roughly half a cup of the hot sauce my Aunt Marge made before the incident." She tilted her head. "Oh, and fresh horseradish. I always say fresh horseradish really opens up the sinuses." A phosphin in the crowd fainted clean away. Just folded. Two companions caught him before he hit the floor, and they stood there holding him up with the slightly dazed expressions of people who had not anticipated needing to do that this evening. Vorcal was making sounds that had no clear precedent in my experience. Labored, wheezing sounds, punctuated by what I can only describe as a biological equivalent of a machine running too many processes simultaneously. His exoskeleton's color cycling had accelerated to the point where it produced a faint, continuous shimmer, like heat distortion above hot metal. He knocked over his third beverage, reaching for it, grabbed the fourth, paused, and then, with a decision that I would have tried to prevent if I had been standing closer, poured the entire container directly over his own head. "I can do this," he muttered, the words aimed less at the crowd than at himself. At whatever part of himself was still operating on the certainty of 12 years of biological invincibility. "I am Vorcal. I am unpoisonable. I am—" He took a fourth bite. That was the moment. His exoskeleton went completely transparent. The crowd's collective gasp was loud enough to register as a minor sound event in the station's environmental monitoring logs. I know this because I checked afterward. The gasp registered. We could see through Vorcal's crystalline exterior to the biological machinery beneath, and I want to be delicate here because he was, despite everything, a living being in genuine distress. What we could see suggested that his internal systems were engaged in something that could only be described as a democratic uprising. Multiple processes competing simultaneously for priority. His body doing everything at once because it could not determine what to address first. "What?" he whispered, and the magnificent voice that usually filled rooms and corridors had reduced itself to something barely above a breath. "What is the protein?" "The ground meat." "What is it?" "Beef," Dorothy said. "Nice lean ground beef, brown with onions and garlic." A tremor of hope moved across Vorcal's translucent features. "Just beef." "Well," Dorothy said, in the tone of someone completing a sentence that has more to it, "and some chorizo for depth of flavor, Italian sausage for texture, bacon lardons for a bit of crunch, and some diced ham I had left over from yesterday that seemed a shame to waste." Vorcal made a sound like a large engine discovering that it had been asked to run on the wrong fuel. His forearms came together across his midsection. His legs buckled at the knees. His exoskeleton was now doing something I had no framework to describe, simultaneously transparent and cycling through colors, producing an effect that several witnesses later told me they were going to need time to process. He looked at the casserole. He looked at Dorothy. He looked at 200 beings who had traveled from across the station. and across multiple sectors of the network to watch this exact moment. His exoskeleton settled, slowly, with the gravity of something enormous coming to rest, on a uniform, quiet, unmistakable gray. The gray of defeat. The gray of a worldview encountering its first serious structural failure. "I concede," he whispered, and then Chef Vorcal, master of 743 culinary arts, conqueror of Zarian venom fruit, the Unpoisonable, slid in a slow, crystalline heap to the floor of his own restaurant, conscious but comprehensively immobilized, producing small, continuous sounds that suggested his internal experience was still very much ongoing. The restaurant erupted. Medical arrived in 4 minutes, which I noted in my subsequent incident report as genuinely impressive given that they had to push through approximately 200 beings in various states of excitement, all trying to get a better view. The Krellian medic leading the response team was named Tessa. I'd worked with her during the Great Splurge Beetle incident, which is a separate story, and she scanned Vorcal with 3 different devices while wearing the expression of someone encountering something that wasn't covered in her training. "Vital signs are stable," she announced loudly enough for the crowd. "Elevated heart rate, significant inflammatory response throughout his digestive tract, and his chemical regulation systems are completely scrambled. But he is in no mortal danger." She ran a secondary scan, read the result, and shook her head with a quiet wonder of professional bewilderment. Whatever he ingested has essentially triggered every neutralization pathway he possesses simultaneously. His biology is attempting to respond to 17 distinct chemical compounds at once, across multiple molecular categories, while also managing an inflammatory response triggered by something that doesn't technically register as a toxin at all. She paused. "I have genuinely never seen anything like this." "Will he recover?" someone called from the crowd. "Physically, yes. In 6 to 8 hours, his system will have processed everything and returned to baseline function." Tessa looked up from her scanner. "Emotionally and psychologically, that falls outside my department." The crowd laughed, and it was warm laughter, the kind that isn't cruel but is extremely honest. As the medical team loaded Vorcal onto a transport gurney, he was conscious, cooperative in the loose-limbed way of someone who has simply run out of resistance, still that quiet, defeated gray. They wheeled him toward the exit. The crowd parted. There was something almost ceremonial about the silence that fell as he passed, a collective respect for a genuinely remarkable being who had just encountered the edge of his remarkable limits. As the gurney drew level with Dorothy, Vorcal managed to raise one trembling hand. His voice, when he found it, was barely a whisper. "How?" he asked. Just that. Just the one word, carrying in it the weight of everything he'd built his identity around, and the first crack in its foundation. "How did you do this to me?" Dorothy stepped forward. She reached out and patted his crystalline arm with the gentle, matter-of-fact warmth of someone comforting a child who has just discovered that the world is more complicated than they believed. Then she did something I didn't expect. She pulled a chair from the nearest table, sat down beside the gurney, and began to explain. Tessa, the medic, produced a small data recorder. She didn't announce she was doing it. She just quietly started taking notes, with a focused look of someone who has recognized that they are in the presence of genuinely useful information. "It's not about one ingredient," Dorothy began. She held up one hand and began counting on her fingers. "First, the dairy. 3 types of cheese, heavy cream, all requiring different enzymatic processes to break down. Your body has to run those processes in parallel, which it can do, but they take processing power." She raised a second finger. "Then the carbohydrates. Pasta creates a dense base that slows the overall progress through your system. You can't hurry the other reactions because the substrate is moving slowly. Everything backs up." Vorcal was listening. His eyes, usually so sharp and directive, had softened into something receptive, something genuinely attentive. "Then come the spices," Dorothy continued, and a murmur of anticipation ran through the crowd. Not 1 or 2, but 17 distinct varieties, each one activating different receptors, different response pathways. Your biology is incredibly good at identifying a threat and addressing it, but 17 distinct simultaneous threats, each requiring a different response, across different receptor types. She shook her head, almost admiringly. "Your system has to make decisions, and while it's making decisions, the meat proteins arrive. 5 types, Vorcal said faintly, as though he was just now putting pieces together. 5 types, Dorothy confirmed, each with a different fat content, different molecular structure, different processing requirement. Your biology doesn't know which to prioritize, and that's where the vegetables do their quiet work. She leaned forward very slightly, and the entire crowd leaned with her. Onions and garlic contain sulfur compounds that interfere with your natural detoxification processes. Not enough to harm you on their own. Your system is more than capable of handling either one individually. But combined with everything else, they are like small, cheerful saboteurs. They make everything else slightly harder to manage. She paused. The restaurant was so quiet I could hear the environmental system. "And the horseradish," said someone near the front, softly, almost reverently. Dorothy smiled. "The horseradish," she agreed, allylisothiocyanate. Not technically a toxin. Your body doesn't classify it as a threat and doesn't mobilize against it, but it causes an immediate, comprehensive inflammatory response in every mucous membrane it contacts. Sinuses, throat, esophagus, stomach, intestinal tract. She spread her hands. So while your system is already at full capacity, managing 17 capsaicin nodes, processing 5 meat proteins, breaking down 3 cheese varieties, handling sulfur compounds from the alliums, untangling the dairy fats, working through the slow-moving carbohydrate substrate, your entire respiratory and digestive tract suddenly stages a unanimous protest. She folded her hands again. It's like being asked to juggle, ride a unicycle, and solve a differential equation simultaneously. You can do any one of them, probably any 2, but all 3 at once, while someone adds more balls to the juggle. She shook her head gently. Eventually, even the most remarkable system reaches a limit of what it can hold. The silence stretched. Then Kel, somewhere in the crowd, said, "That's diabolical." "That's cooking, dear," Dorothy replied, with the mild pleasure of someone who has been given an accurate compliment. "The art isn't in making something poisonous. Anyone can poison someone. That requires only chemistry and malice, neither of which is very interesting. The art is in making something entirely safe, nutritionally sound, genuinely nourishing, that nonetheless creates such a complex cascade of biological responses that even the most exceptional system gets overwhelmed." She paused. "And that requires understanding, not just of ingredients, of systems, of how things work together, and what happens when you ask too much of anything all at once." The medical team had been waiting with commendable patience. They began to move the gurney again, gently, toward the exit. At the door, Vorcal turned his head one final time. His voice was still quiet, stripped of all its performance, all its thunder and gold. Just a voice. "Why is it called a funeral casserole?" Dorothy stood and smoothed her cardigan. 7 alarms for the 7 pepper varieties," she said. "Funeral because the first time my grandmother served it, 3 people at the table said they could see their entire lives passing before their eyes." A small, genuine smile. But they all came back for seconds. So she figured she had a winner. The doors closed. For 3 full seconds, the restaurant was completely silent. Then someone began to clap. One person. Somewhere near the back, their applause tentative and then certain. Someone else joined. Then another, and within moments the entire room was applauding. Not the cruel triumph of a crowd watching someone fail, but something more complex and more generous than that. The sound of 200 beings acknowledging that they had just witnessed something genuinely remarkable from both directions. I made my way through the crowd to Dorothy, who had returned to her casserole and was recovering the foil with the practiced efficiency of someone who has places to be and things to store. "Miss Kowalski," I said, and I meant every word of it. "That was the most remarkable thing I have witnessed in 12 cycles on this station." She waved a hand. "Oh, it was just a casserole. Dear. It sent a man to the medical suite. He'll be fine by morning." She picked up her dish and tucked it under one arm. "You should see what happens when I make my chili." She paused at the door and glanced back at me with an expression that contained, somewhere in its depths, about 60 years of accumulated knowledge about the universe and its various inhabitants. "My grandson still won't talk about Thanksgiving, and is a grown man who works with industrial fusion reactors for a living." She walked out, I stood there for a moment in the noise and warmth of the restaurant, surrounded by 200 beings talking all at once, and I thought about that. The story spread the way remarkable things spread on station networks, faster than it should have been possible, with every retelling adding new detail while somehow preserving the essential truth of what had happened. By the following morning, I had received inquiries from administrators on 6 other stations. The video of the event, captured by at least 40 different devices from as many angles, had been viewed over 4 million times across the network by the end of the week. Someone had turned it into a music remix that I'm told became genuinely popular in several sectors, set to a style of Earth music called something I can't transliterate accurately, but which Kel described as aggressively cheerful. Humans, I learned, found the whole thing absolutely hilarious. Not in a mean-spirited way, or at least, not primarily, but in the way that humans laugh at things that have proven a point they already knew, that have demonstrated something about the world that they find fundamentally satisfying to see demonstrated. Several human crew members sought me out specifically to tell me, with great satisfaction, that they could have told anyone that would happen. You never challenge a grandmother's recipe, a human engineer named Petra told me, with the gravity of someone sharing ancient wisdom. That's like Rule 1. Vorcal reopened his restaurant a week later. I heard about it from Kel, who heard about it from one of the Krellian merchants, who had apparently been checking. I walked past on my evening rounds and stopped. He'd changed the sign. The tall white hat was gone. The golden celestial palette and elaborate lettering had been replaced simply with Vorcals. The gold of the letters was quieter now, a practical gold rather than a proclamation. Inside, I could see him moving through the dining room, speaking to tables at a volume that was, for the first time I could recall, actually appropriate to a restaurant. His exoskeleton was still gold, but a softer shade, less the gold of someone announcing themselves, more the gold of someone simply getting on with their work. And at the top of his menu, in letters large enough to read from the corridor entrance, was a new addition: human cuisine, traditional preparations available upon request. Approach with genuine respect. We are not responsible for the experience, but we will be with you through it. Below that, in smaller text, recommended for the curious, the adventurous, and those who feel their worldview could benefit from some recalibration. I stood there reading it for a long moment. Then I went inside and ordered dinner. Dorothy visited the restaurant once before she left the station. I happened to be passing through Sector Green when it happened, which was a coincidence I will maintain with complete conviction. Vorcal saw her through the window while she was still in the corridor. His exoskeleton shifted immediately to a deep, clear blue, the Thoraxian color of respect. Genuine respect, not the performance of it. He came out, all 4 arms extended in the traditional gesture of open-handed acknowledgement, and stopped in front of her with something that looked remarkably like humility on a being who had previously treated humility as a character flaw in other species. "Miss Kowalski," he said quietly, "I wanted to apologize for my dismissiveness, for my condescension." He held her gaze. "For the hat, frankly, I've thought about the hat." A pause. "You demonstrated something to me that I clearly needed to understand, and you did it with considerably more grace than I deserved." Dorothy looked at him for a moment, tilting her head slightly, the way she did when she was assessing something with care. Then she nodded once, with a clean, decisive quality of someone closing a ledger. "Apology accepted. You're a gifted chef. You just needed to remember that gifts and wisdom are different things, and that the second one takes longer to earn." She looked at the menu board visible through the window. "You're cooking other cultures' food now." "Trying to," he said, carefully, with a great deal of research and considerably more humility than I previously considered necessary. His exoskeleton shifted briefly through a color that might have been sheepish. "I've been consulting with representatives from each species whose dishes I want to include, asking for guidance rather than assuming understanding." Dorothy smiled, and this time the smile was entirely warm. "That's how you do it." "Would you?" He hesitated, and the hesitation was itself remarkable on a being who had formerly been incapable of uncertainty. "Would you share the recipe? The casserole?" "Absolutely not," Dorothy said, with cheerful and absolute finality. 6 generations of family tradition. It'll go to my granddaughter when she's ready for it." She reached into her bag and produced a small jar. "But hey," My regular salsa, the mild version, just to show there are no hard feelings. She handed it to him. He took it with 2 hands, a gesture of Thoraxian respect for significant gifts, and looked at the label, then at her, then at the label again. The mild version, he said. The mild version, she confirmed pleasantly. He later told me he tried exactly 1 spoonful, and then sat very quietly for approximately 4 to 5 minutes. The jar now sits in a small display case near the entrance of Vorcal's restaurant, on a simple platform with a small engraved plaque beneath it. The plaque reads, "A reminder that humility is not a weakness." The Krellian merchants who had witnessed the original confrontation, the ones who had just wanted to eat their dinner in peace, became regulars. They told me the food was better now, more thoughtful, more attentive to what you actually wanted rather than what the chef had decided you should experience. Vorcal listened now, in the way that only people who have been genuinely wrong about something important can learn to listen. 3 months after the casserole incident, which is what it was called across at least 4 station networks by that point, I was doing my routine administrative rounds when I noticed something new in the station cafeteria. Between the Krellian nutrient paste and the phosphine radiation snacks, a new section had appeared, its sign recently installed and slightly crooked in the way of things done by people too excited to level properly. Human comfort foods, traditional recipes. Proceed with curiosity and appropriate caution. They were selling out every single day. A Zenthari trader I knew by reputation stopped me in the corridor one morning to report that he had tried something called gumbo and spent 20 minutes producing what he described as emotional fluids from his optical organs. He was insistent that they were happy fluids. His species does not, technically, produce such fluids. He was equally insistent on this point and seemed unbothered by the contradiction. A Thoraxian engineer, not Vorcal, but a younger one from the technical division, tried macaroni and cheese with pickled jalapenos and described the experience as reorganizing. He meant it as a compliment. He went back for more. Kel tried something called beef stew and was quiet for a day afterward in the contemplative way of someone who has encountered information that requires integration. I tried Dorothy's casserole. She had left a small container for me as a thank you for the kitchen access on a quiet Tuesday evening in my administrative office, between filing 2 cargo dispute reports and an environmental compliance review. I sat alone at my desk, the container open in front of me, and I took 1 bite. And I understood. It was delicious. It was overwhelming. It was, simultaneously, the most comforting and the most confrontational thing I had ever eaten, something that demanded your full attention while also making you feel, in some way I couldn't quite account for, looked after. It tasted like someone who knew what they were doing had decided you deserved something real. Not careful, not calibrated. Real. I sat there for a few minutes afterward, doing nothing, which is something I almost never do. Then I picked up my stylus and opened my incident report for the evening. In the standard field mark lessons learned, I wrote, "Never underestimate a human grandmother. They carry centuries of survival, love, ingenuity, and accumulated wisdom in their hands, and they will pack all of it into a single dish and serve it to you with a smile. They have fought wars and raised families and refined their knowledge across generations, and they will deploy every bit of it, with complete precision, at exactly the right moment. Do not give them a reason to demonstrate this. And if, despite your best judgment, you find yourself on the receiving end of that demonstration, sit down, eat the whole thing, and pay attention. You will learn something. You might also need to lie down for a while afterward. That is normal. Best advice I ever filed. My name is Rickto, and I've been the Station Administrator Meridian 7 for 12 cycles now. People like to make that title sound impressive when they introduce me at functions, but what it actually means is that I solve everyone's problems while they pretend I don't exist. I've mediated cargo disputes that nearly started trade wars. I've overseen diplomatic incidents involving a Zenthari ambassador's emotional support creature somehow finding its way into the main ventilation shaft and terrorizing half the station for 6 hours. I've processed paperwork for births, deaths, marriages, and at least one legal situation that defied every category I had available in the standard forms. I thought I had seen everything. I was wrong. Nothing, and I want to be absolutely clear about this, nothing in 12 cycles of station administration prepared me for what happened in Sector Green, Level 4, at the most aggressively pretentious dining establishment this side of the Andromeda Gateway. It was called Vorcal's Celestial Palate. Stupid name, if you ask me. But then again, nobody ever does. The restaurant had been open for about 8 months when all of this unfolded, and in that short time, Chef Vorcal had already managed to make himself the most insufferable culinary figure in 7 systems. He was a Thoraxian, tall, imposing, with that distinctive crystalline exoskeleton that shifted color based on his emotional state, the way a mood ring might have mood rings were the size of a grown adult and had an opinion about everything. He had 4 arms, each one moving with the fluid, theatrical precision of an orchestra conductor who had consumed too much caffeine, and an ego so enormous that it had its own gravitational pull. Every single evening, without fail, Vorcal would position himself at the entrance of his restaurant wearing a towering white chef's hat that he claimed was inspired by the ancient culinary traditions of Earth. The irony of that particular detail would become clear later. Trust me, he'd greet arriving customers with a voice that boomed through the surrounding corridors like a public announcement, making absolutely certain that every being within earshot understood that his establishment was not just open for business, but open for transcendent experience. "Welcome, welcome, my distinguished patrons," he would bellow, his exoskeleton shifting to a proud, burnished gold. "Come and experience flavors that will elevate your very understanding of sustenance. I, Chef Vorcal, master of 743 culinary art across 12 systems, guarantee you a meal that will forever alter your relationship with food itself." Yes, he talked like that all the time. Now, here's the thing about Vorcal that made him particularly grating, beyond the theatrics and the booming voice and the hat. He wasn't just a talented chef, and damn him, because he absolutely was. His food was extraordinary. No, what made him genuinely insufferable was a biological quirk unique to his species that he treated as a personal achievement. Vorcal was essentially immune to toxins. All toxins. Any toxins. Thoraxians had evolved on a death world, a planet where the atmosphere itself played host to a perpetual chemical arms race between every living thing. Plants produced compounds that would dissolve most creatures on contact. Animals excreted substances that could stop hearts within seconds. Even the water table contained trace amounts of neurotoxins that would have rendered most species comatose within minutes of exposure. For millions of years, Thoraxian biology had adapted, refined, and hardened against this relentless chemical assault until their system could identify, isolate, and neutralize almost any toxic compound they encountered with a speed and efficiency that no medical technology had yet managed to replicate. It was, objectively speaking, remarkable. Vorcal, however, did not treat it as a biological inheritance. He treated it as a personal virtue, a character achievement, something he had somehow earned through sheer force of will and obvious superiority. He spoke about it constantly, loudly, and with the bottomless self-satisfaction of someone who had confused luck with genius. I wandered into Vorcal's celestial palate on a Tuesday evening, after a shift so brutal it had left me questioning the choices that had led me to station administration in the first place. A Zentari trader had arrived that morning with 40 crates of cargo he had cheerfully classified as non-hazardous on his manifest. Spoiler alert, they were extraordinarily hazardous. I had spent 4 hours in the decontamination suite while a medical technician named Brev looked at me with an expression that I can only describe as professionally sympathetic but personally entertained. I needed a drink. I needed food. I needed a chair that wasn't a decontamination goney, and I needed to sit in it for at least an hour without anyone asking me to authorize, review, or stamp anything. Vorcal's was the closest establishment to my current trajectory, and in my depleted state, proximity won over preference. I slid into a seat near the back just in time to catch Vorcal in the middle of one of his performances. There was a table of Krellian merchants, 4 of them, the sort of seasoned interstellar traders who had clearly seen enough of the galaxy to develop a very low tolerance for nonsense, trying to eat their meal in peace. Vorcal was hovering over them like an enormous, self-satisfied storm cloud, his exoskeleton cycling through delighted amber tones as he gesticulated with 2 of his arms while the other 2 simultaneously plated something that appeared to be a purple foam sculpture. "You see," he was saying, his voice carrying effortlessly across the entire restaurant so that no one could possibly miss a word, "most chefs are afraid of their ingredients. They approach their kitchens like scientists, measuring cautiously, tasting tentatively, always hedging against the unknown. But not I." He paused here for effect, spreading his 2 free arms wide in a gesture of magnificent confidence. "I can consume anything, test any combination, push any boundary. Because nothing, absolutely nothing, can harm me. One of the Krellian merchants, a woman with a kind of tired eyes that spoke of too many negotiation tables and not enough sleep, made the critical mistake of engaging with him. "Surely there must be something out there that could affect you, chef," she said, in the polite but slightly desperate tone of someone hoping that asking a question might redirect a monologue. "The universe is vast." She should not have said that. Vorcal's exoskeleton flashed brilliant crimson, the Thoraxian color for aggressive excitement, the biological equivalent of someone cracking their knuckles before a demonstration they've been waiting all day to give.